I Know What You Did Last Wednesday, Part 8. Needles. Tim didn't sleep well that night. Although I hadn't said anything, not wanting to upset him, he managed to work out that he's the next to be on the killer's list. Next on the killer's list. He also knew that his own murder would have something to do with needlework, so he was looking for needles everywhere. By 1 o'clock in the morning, he knew that there was no sewing needles in the room, no knitting needles, no pine needles. Even so, it took him an hour to get into bed, and several more hours to get to sleep. Mind you, nobody would have found it easy to get into sleep, dressed in a full suit of medieval armour. But that still hadn't stopped Tim putting it on. There could be a poisoned needle in the mattress, he said, or someone could try and inject me with a syringe. Tim didn't snore that night. He clanked. Every time he rolled over, he sounded like 20 cans of beans in a washing machine. I just hoped he wasn't planning to take a bath in that suit of armour the following morning. That way he would end up rusting to death. At 4:30 he woke up screaming. "What is it, Tim?" I asked. "I had a bad dream, Nick," he said. "Don't tell me you saw a needle." "No, I saw a haystack." I didn't sleep well either. I got cramp and woke up in the morning with pins and needles. I didn't tell Tim though, he'd have a fit. We had breakfast together in the kitchen. Neither of us ate very much. For a start, we were surrounded by dead bodies, which didn't make us feel exactly cheerful. But Tim was so terrified. I'd managed to persuade him to change out of the armour, but now he was worrying about the food. Were there going to be needles in the cereal? A needle in the tea? In the end, I gave him a straw with a tissue sellotaped over the end. The tissue worked well as a filter, and he was able to suck the little orange juice and a very softly boiled egg. I had to say that for once I was baffled. It was like being in an Agatha Christie novel. Only this time I couldn't flick through to the last page to see who did it without bothering to read the rest. Personally, I'd always thought that Eric had been the killer. He seems to have the strongest motive, being half drowned on the last day of school. It was funny, really. All 8 of the boys and girls of St. Egbert's had disliked each other, but someone, somewhere, had disliked all of them even more. The whole thing had been planned right down to the last detail, and the last detail, unfortunately, was Tim. But who and why? Tim sat miserably at the end of his table, hardly daring to move. Why had he had to come first in needlework of all things? How was I supposed to find the needle that was going to kill him? I knew now that the only hope for me was to solve this thing before the killer struck one last time. And a nasty thought had already occurred to me. Would the killer stop with Tim? I wasn't part of this. I'd never gone to St. Edbert's, but I was witness to what happened, and maybe I'd sinned too much. I went over what had happened last night. We had always assumed that there was nobody else on the island, but thinking it through, I knew this couldn't be true. We'd been sitting down, Brenda in front of the organ, Eric opposite her, Mark nearest the door, and Tim and me on the sofa. But none of us had even been anywhere near the light switch, and someone had most certainly turned the lights off, not just in the drawing room, but throughout the entire house. Somewhere down in the basement there would be a main fuse switch. But that led to another question. If the killer had been down in the basement, then how had he or she managed to appear in the room seconds later to shoot Eric and push the organ pipe onto Brenda? At the time, I had assumed that Mark had committed the last 2 murders. There had been a shot, then a flood, then the opening and closing of a door. But a few seconds later, Mark had himself been killed. And what about the leaves that I'd seen lying next to the body? How did they get there? I thought back to the other murders. Rory first. We'd all been on the island, and we'd all separated. Any one of us could have attacked him, and immediately afterwards left the chocolate on the bed for Sylvie to find. That was the night I'd seen the face in the window, a face that had appeared and disappeared impossibly in seconds. And then we had found Janet. I remember her lying in the bed, stabbed by a model of the Eiffel Tower. Her room had been shabby. There had been a tear in the canopy. I had remarked on it at the time. Why had it caught my eye? Libby Goldman next. The television presenter had been knocked down with a model globe. There was something strange about that too. Someone must have carried it up to the roof and dropped it on her when she came out the front door. But now I thought about it, I hadn't seen the globe in any of the rooms when we'd been searching the house. That could only mean one thing. It had been on the roof from the very start, waiting for her. Maybe you know how it is when you've been given a particularly nasty piece of homework, an impossible equation or a fiendish bit of physics or something. You stare at it, but there's just ink on the paper, and you're about to give up. when you suddenly notice something and suddenly you realise it's not so difficult after all. Well, that was what was happening to me now. I remembered the search party slowly crisscrossing the island, with security cameras everywhere from the day I had arrived, and I had felt like I was being watched. There was a security camera in the kitchen. I looked up, and it was watching me even now. Were there cameras in other rooms too? At the same time, I remembered something Mark had said when we all found the old photograph of St. Edbert's. And in that school, as quickly as that, I suddenly knew everything. And in that second, as quickly as that, I suddenly knew everything. "I've got it, Tim," I said. "So have I, Nick," Tim cried. I'd been so wrapped up in my thoughts I hadn't noticed that Tim had been thinking too. Now he was staring at me with the sort of look you see on a fish when it's spent too long out of water. "You know who did it?" I asked. "Yes." "Go on." "It's simple," Tim explained. "First there were 8 of us on the island, then 7, then 6, then 5. "I know," I interrupted. "I can count backwards." "Well, now there are only 2 of us left. I know it wasn't me who committed the murders." He reached forward and snatched the spoon. Then he realised what he'd done, put it down and snatched up the knife. He waved at me. "So the killer must be you," he exclaimed. "What?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "There was only us left, you and me. You know it wasn't me, so it must have been you." "But why would I want to kill everyone?" I demanded. "You tell me." "I wouldn't, and I didn't. Don't be ridiculous, Tim." I stood up. That was a mistake. "Don't come near me," Tim yelled, and suddenly he sprang out of his chair and jumped out of the window. This was an impressive feat. The window wasn't even open. I couldn't believe what had happened. I knew Tim was stupid, but this was remarkable even by his standards. Maybe sleeping in a suit of armour had done something to his tiny organism he called his brain. At the same time, he was worried. I knew who the killer was, and I knew who was lined up to be the next victim. Tim was outside of the house, on his own. He made himself into the perfect target. I had no choice. I went after him, jumping through the shattered window. I could see Tim a short distance away, running towards the tail of Crocodile Island. I had no idea where he was going, but nor, of course, did he. He was panicking, just trying to put as much distance between the 2 of us as he could. Not easy, considering he was trapped on a small island. "Tim," I called. He didn't stop. I ran after him, following the path as he began to climb steeply towards the cliffs. This was where the island was tapered to a point. I slowed down. Tim had already reached the far end. He had nowhere else to go. The wind blew his hair around his head, and as he turned to face me, he was still holding the knife. The knife, I noticed now that it was a butter knife. If he stabbed me with all his strength, he might just manage to give me a small bruise. His face was pale, his eyes were wide open and staring. The last time I'd seen him like this was when they had shown Jurassic Park on TV. "Get back, Nick," he yelled. It was hard to hear him above the crash of the waves. "You're crazy, Tim," I called back. "Why would I want to hurt you? I'm your brother. Think about all the adventures we've had together. All the times I've saved your life a ton of times." I thought of telling him that I loved him, but I know that wasn't true. "I quite like you," I said. "You've looked after me ever since Mum and Dad emigrated to Australia. We've had fun together." Tim hesitated. I could see the doubt in his eyes. He lowered the butter knife. A huge wave rolled in and crashed against the rocks, spraying us both with freezing salt water. I looked past Tim at the rocks. An idea was forming in my mind. There were 6 great iron rocks jutting out of the sea. I had noticed them the day we had searched the island, and of course rocks like that have a name. Long and slender, with pointed tops, standing upright in the water. They're called needles. I'm not exactly sure what happened next, but I do know that it happened all at the same time. There was a soft explosion where Tim was standing. The earth underneath his feet seemed to separate, falling away. Tim screamed and his arm jerked. The butter knife span in the air, the sun glinting off the blade. I yelled and threw myself forward. Somehow my hands had managed to grab hold of Tim's shirt. "Don't kill me," Tim whimpered. "I'm not killing you, you idiot," I yelled. "I'm saving you." We rolled back together away from the edge of the cliff, an edge that was now several centimetres closer to us than it had been a few seconds before. I was dazed and there was grass in my mouth, but I realised that the killer had struck again. There had been a small explosive charge buried in the ground at the end of the cliff. Someone had detonated it, and if I hadn't managed to grab hold of Tim, he would have fallen down towards the sea, only to crash into the needles 50 metres below.